Good morning to all of you. Mark Fernstein is a senior advisor to the Albright Stonebridge group. He is a Latin American expert. He was a key player in the Obama administration. He served at the White House as special assistant to the president and being a special director for Western Hemisphere affairs. In that capacity, he helped implement the president's normalization policy to Cuba and orchestrate the president's trip to Cuba and Argentina. He also oversaw the development of the President of Colombia's peace initiative. He coordinated the increase in U.S. assistance to Central America and advanced and deepened U.S. cooperation with Canada and Mexico. Mr. Fernstein also worked at the U.S. Agency for International Development as acting deputy administrator and assistant administrator for Latin America and the Caribbean. In the Clinton administration, he worked at the State Department as special assistant to U.S. ambassador to the Organization of American States and a senior advisor of USAID for elections. Welcome, Mark. Mark today, he plans to talk to us about President-elect Joseph Biden's priorities for Latin America and potential interplay between the administrators in Congress and on the Western Hemisphere. Mark, welcome.
Well, thanks so much, Alfonso. Very much appreciate the introduction, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak to the Latin Trade Conference today. What I'd like to do is, as noted, talk a little bit about what we might expect from a Biden administration with regard to Latin America. And I'll be drawing from my experience in the Obama-Biden administration, my work with the then Vice President Biden, and public comments that he has made during the campaign. And what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the process by which I think policy will be made, talk a bit about the tone that I think the new president, the new administration will establish, discuss some of the thematic issues that they will try to advance globally and in the hemisphere, and then talk a bit about the policy with regard to some key countries in Latin America. And I want to talk a little bit also about how Latin America might fit into the administration's broader global policy. I'll try to keep my comments as brief as possible so I can then take your questions and speak to issues of most salience for all of you. The first big change I think that we're going to see in a Biden administration is really with regard to the policymaking process. There will be a process in place, unlike we've seen that's been the case for the last 4 years. So there will be a deliberative policy process in place, led by the White House, in which they seek input and incorporate advice from experts in various departments and agencies. There'll be engagement with other countries, with the private sector, with NGOs. You will no longer have policy by tweets, which prompt the US government and people around the world to try to figure out what the heck that meant. So, companies that you may all represent will not be surprised, I would think, by what ultimately emerges from a cohesive policy process. The next change will be with regard to tone. A Biden administration will treat allies with respect. They will no longer utilize intimidation and threats as a principal policy tool. And you'll see that policy will be based on common interests and mutual benefit. As you know, that the current president believes that if one country gains in a relationship, the other one must be losing. Joe Biden sees the world very differently. He understands that the United States benefits from productive relationships with other countries. Joe Biden also believes, in contrast to the current administration, he believes in the value of multilateral cooperation. In the hemisphere, I think we'll see that play out, whether it's the OAS or development banks and working with international organizations like the UN and others in Latin America. And there will certainly be an effort to work more closely with our allies to try to solve common problems. Joe Biden also believes in personal diplomacy. As you all know, he has a special way of connecting with people, with anyone, whether it's average citizens, heads of state. And it's something I saw when I was participating in meetings with him when he was vice president. And it was just, he's a mesmerizing speaker and just a great storyteller. And foreign leaders have found him very, very engaging. And I think that by establishing that personal rapport, he was able to establish a connection and be more effective in advancing U.S. interests as well. Now, the president-elect has vast experience on Latin America from his days in the Senate. He, of course, was a chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and then, of course, his 8 years as vice president. He was the father of Plan Colombia some 20 years ago, and under President Obama, Joe Biden oversaw the U.S. approach to the region in the second term. And in fact, Latin America was one of his 3 particular global responsibilities, foreign policy responsibilities that he was given by President Obama. It was Latin America, Iraq, and Ukraine. And Joe Biden sees real possibilities in the region based on his experience. He believes it has great potential. He understands the region is vital for U.S. economic and security interests. And unlike, the current occupant in the White House, Joe Biden's also interested in the well-being of people in the region. Now, a Biden administration will look to engage with the entire region. And I think what you've seen in the last 2 years really is a policy based on a so-called troika. And it was quite notable, I think, a couple of years ago when John Bolton gave a speech, I think it was in Miami, and he laid out the Trump administration's, what he said, the Trump administration's policy toward Latin America. And it ended up being a speech about 3 countries, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. And he barely mentioned Colombia, Mexico, Brazil, just sort of got passing reference, I think, all those major countries. Now, obviously, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, obviously important countries and important matters to resolve, but they can't make up an entire policy toward the region. Now, Latin America does tend to get overshadowed by other regions, by crises in other regions. And certainly, I think a Biden administration will be preoccupied by issues involving China and Russia, ISIS, the war in Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea. We can make a long, long list. And invariably, we're going to see reports that Latin America is being neglected. And we see such reports in nearly every administration. And generally speaking, it's just not true. Presidents and senior officials invariably deal with crises. And when officials gather in the Situation Room in the White House to discuss problematic issues, that tends to be what the Situation Room is used for when there's real crises. And the press writes about crises around the world. But meanwhile, the huge foreign policy apparatus of the United States turns away, managing a slew of issues. And for me, frankly, it's a good thing that Latin America is generally not a topic of discussion in the Situation Room. You don't want your country discussed there. And it probably means that things are not going particularly well, that there's some emergency. When I was the senior director in the NSC, senior director for Western Hemisphere Affairs, the last 2 years of the Obama administration, we occasionally would gather principals of agencies and deputies of agencies in the Situation Room, but it was rare. My colleagues, for example, who were dealing with Ukraine and Russia or ISIS, they were there a couple times a week. So I think you want a situation where you're not necessarily dealing with crises, and which matters can be dealt with at assistant secretary level or other appropriate levels, when you engage the most senior officials when necessary. Now, there are a number of global priorities that will impact how a Biden administration approaches Latin America. I just want to underscore a few. One is climate change. Joe Biden will likely have the United States rejoin the Paris Accord from day one of his administration. The United States will work very hard to meet its obligations under the Accord. I think it'll hold other countries to their obligations as well. But I think we can expect a Biden administration to look to promote clean energy and to try to help countries make that transition away from fossil fuels as well. A second issue that'll be highlighted by the administration that has really been given short shrift by the current one is democracy and human rights. As we know, Donald Trump has an affinity for authoritarian rulers to the extent that the current administration has advocated for democracy. It's done so on an ideological basis, focused on abuses from the left and giving a pass to abuses from countries that are more conservative. Under Joe Biden, even our allies will be expected to respect the rule of law, freedom of the press, and countries won't get a buy simply because they're helping us on migration or because they moved an embassy in Israel. There'll be expectations with regard to the respect for human rights, notwithstanding the remainder of the relationship with the United States. I think the most important thing that a Biden administration will do with respect to democracy promotion in Latin America and frankly globally is that they will lead by example. Joe Biden will not call reporters enemy of the people. He will not interfere in Department of Justice investigations. And when Democrats lose an election, he won't make baseless accusations of fraud. So authoritarian leaders will no longer have a cover, if you will, in the White House for their anti-democratic moves. Now, one issue that will obviously dominate the first year of a Biden administration, both domestically and internationally, is COVID. I think in many ways it's going to frame everything early on in the Biden administration. Priorities, the bandwidth that officials have to manage issues, the resources that it has to deploy, and fighting the pandemic will have to be a top global priority. But especially in Latin America, given how hard hit the region is. And we know some countries have tried to do the right thing and still got, impacted. In other cases, some countries have had a very, very poor response, just like we've had in the United States. But I would expect the Biden administration to lead a global effort and to lead a regional effort based on the understanding that the only way to combat and defeat the pandemic ultimately is to defeat it in every. So I want to take a few minutes now to talk about some key countries in the region and what we might expect from a Biden administration. And I'll start with Mexico, which of course is one of the most important relationships, if not the most important bilateral relationship that the United States has. Joe Biden, when he was in the Obama administration, led the U.S.-Mexico high-level dialogue. He had a lot of experience with the country. And in the Obama administration, I think we built on the efforts of previous U.S. administrations to construct a relationship, to find ways to cooperate. That was in contrast to the U.S.-Mexican relationship just 20, 30 years ago. And it's remarkable the extent to which relations have between the two countries have intensified and their ability to find ways to cooperate on issues of common concern. Donald Trump, as we all know, put that relationship at risk. That said, I think there have been great efforts by others on both sides, in both countries, to keep things on track the last few years. You've had senior officials, career people in various agencies, officers in both countries' embassies. And what it suggests is that there's a real interdependence between the United States and Mexico that you can't turn off, that Donald Trump could not turn off. There's a real resilience to the relationship. Plus, I think in the United States, there's been strong bipartisan support for a healthy relationship with Mexico, or at least there has been. We've all seen developments in recent days and recent months that I think will test the relationship and test that resilience. But substantively, I think what you'll get from the Biden administration is a broader perspective on Mexico than we've seen the last 4 years. The relationship will not be defined simply by border security and by a wall. There'll be efforts to cooperate on energy, on law enforcement, on various regional and global matters. There'll be an effort to intensify trade. And on trade, Joe Biden's history is very clear. He supported NAFTA in the 90s. He also supports the USMCA based on the reforms in labor and environment that Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats were able to include into the agreement. And I think what you'll see from a Biden administration is a real focus on ensuring that those provisions are abided by. Now, on the border and the issue of migration, which will remain important, Biden, believes that there's no trade-off between enforcing immigration laws humanely and protecting our borders. We can do both things simultaneously. And what you can expect from a Biden administration is an upgrading of border technology and infrastructure instead of a wall. He has said he plans to end the Remain in Mexico program. Joe Biden has talked about having a surge of asylum officers to manage the many asylum claims. There's been talk about doubling the number of immigration judges. And Joe Biden has also said he would legalize the Dreamers and try to provide a roadmap to citizenship for undocumented people in the United States. We know in the latter that would require working with Congress, which may pose challenging as it has in the past. On Central America, Joe Biden led the efforts of the Obama administration with regard to the region and the effort to get at the root causes of illegal migration. And as you would recall, the Obama administration dramatically increased assistance to Central America. The only reason we got that assistance was because of Joe Biden and his ability to work on a bipartisan basis. And it was fascinating to listen to his phone calls with key senators, key representatives, Republicans and Democrats. And he had the ability that no other member of the Obama administration would have had, frankly, to obtain the assistance from Congress and the levels that we did. But Joe Biden believes strongly in increasing that assistance, but with conditions. But holding Central American leaders accountable and ensuring that in exchange for that assistance, that they reform economically, reform politically, combat corruption. And I think we did start to see some success with regard to that assistance during the final years of the Obama administration. We saw that, for example, in areas where USAID and others were helping to reduce crime and violence, that there was a real, dramatic increase. Unfortunately, the current administration has cut assistance, and I think set us back there. Now, I mentioned earlier the issue of democracy and human rights. I think in Central America, that's where you're really going to see a change with regard to how the United States engages with those countries. You know, the Trump administration, frankly, looked the other way when presidents in Central America committed electoral fraud to stay in office, or when they shut down human rights bodies that were investigating corruption. That's going to change with the Biden administration. I want to talk about Venezuela a little bit. Will obviously have to be a priority for all the reasons that we know. You know, just a terrible tragedy, the economic crisis, the political crisis, humanitarian crisis, the crimes against humanity that are being committed there. I think in the United States, there is bipartisan agreement on the nature of the Maduro regime. Joe Biden has been very clear. He has described Nicolas Maduro as a dictator and has underscored the need for a democratic transition. What I think you will see from a Biden administration is that they will abandon this approach that was solely focused on sanctions. And this idea of sort of pressure for, often seemed like pressure for the sake of pressure, and an expectation that the Venezuelan regime, Maduro regime, would magically collapse. And it was always unclear what the means of change was going to be. So I think what you'll see from a Biden administration is a smarter approach that combines pressure and sanctions with potential inducements, with diplomacy. I think there'll be more of an effort to work more closely with European allies, with Latin American allies. You will no longer hear from President Biden or his team loose talk about all options being on the table, which was to say, implying that a U.S. military option was possible, that everyone knew that was never the case. But I think that loose talk did a lot of damage because it raised false hopes in Venezuela among some opposition politicians and among the population in general, that there was some external force that was going to come in to save them. And that was never going to be the case. I would expect, don't know, but I would expect that a Biden administration will maintain the targeted sanctions, the sanctions that have been directed at leaders of the Maduro regime, both military and political. I would anticipate a review of economic sanctions, not just on Venezuela, but globally. And I think a Biden administration will want to ensure that any sanctions are helping to advance policy goals there, which in this case, which is a democratic transition, and not merely imposing additional pain on Cuba. I think that you will see a Biden administration, and Joe Biden's been very clear about this, that they will reverse the measures that have been taken the last 2 to 3 years that have hurt the Cuban people and divided Cuban families. And what we've seen from the Trump administration is that they have taken steps that have hurt the people that they're reportedly trying to help. And in particular, that means Cuban entrepreneurs. And if you've been to Cuba, you've seen the growing private sector there and the efforts that entrepreneurs have been making under very, very difficult circumstances. But in Cuban entrepreneurs, you know, they need customers, whether you're running an Airbnb or a private restaurant or a private market, they need customers from Europe and from the United States. And they rely on travel by Americans. So I anticipate you will see from a Biden administration a loosening of travel restrictions to make it easier for Americans to travel there. I think also under the belief that the United States government should not be telling Americans where they can and can't travel. I think you'll also see a reversal of the steps that made it harder for Cuban Americans to send remittances to their families. I would anticipate as well a restoration of the dialogues between U.S. agencies and U.S. departments with their Cuban counterparts. These are dialogues that in some cases began, or in some cases intensified under the Obama administration, dealing with issues like law enforcement, health, and the environment. And if you talk to any career official in those agencies in the United States, they would tell you that those help to advance U.S. interests, notwithstanding all the differences we may have with regard to Cuba and their political system. But on that, I would expect strong rhetoric, at least from the Biden administration, with regard to human rights. I would anticipate there'll be public calls for the Cuban regime to respect human rights, to release political prisoners. And I think also there will be an expectation that the Cubans need to do more. And it's not a question of sort of a quid pro quo. When the United States allows Americans to travel to Cuba or allows companies to do business in Cuba and compete with, Russian companies or Chinese companies or European companies, those aren't concessions. Those are things that are done in the interest of the United States, in the interest of American companies and American people. That said, I think there will be an expectation for Cubans to do more on their side, both with regard to politics and also with regard to economic reform. I would not expect the economic embargo, the embargo on Cuba, to be lifted anytime soon. The President of the United States does not have the authority to do that. The President can tinker with the embargo and allow certain activities to proceed, but ultimately it's up to Congress to lift the embargo, and I think for that to happen, we will need to see much more from Cuba. I want to talk about Brazil, obviously a very important country and an important relationship for the United States. The Brazil-U.S. relationship is always been complex. It's never been all that easy. There are many common interests and shared values of the countries, but at the same time, there have often been significant differences in their approach to foreign policy and how they view the world. And at the same time, though, governments of different ideologies in the United States and Brazil have managed relations fairly well. If you look back at the Bush administration, for example, one of George W. Bush's best friends was Lula. Again, they didn't see the world in the same way, but they were able to establish a constructive relationship, and their administrations had a constructive relationship. Now, I think that might be more complicated now, given that the Brazilian president, his alignment with right-wing nationalist forces around the world, the government's denial of climate change, their negative attitudes toward diversity and inclusion in Brazil. But I think it's important to keep in mind the U.S. has relationships not just with countries, not just with governments, but with countries. And there's a tendency to personalize relationships. And yes, leadership matters, but there's much more to the United States, much more to Brazil than a single leader or a single national government. So there will be, civil society engagement, private sector engagement. And yes, I think both sides, both governments will try to seek common ground to manage their differences, but also find areas where they're in accord and can work closely together. I think a lot will depend on the posture of the Brazilian government. I think it would be helpful for Brazil to understand that on climate change, this is not a fight between the United States and Brazil. The whole world is interested in the Amazon and depends on Brazil, managing in a correct way the Amazon. And I think ultimately, I think that Brazil's relationship with the United States, with other countries, will depend on whether over time Brazil chooses to restore its leadership on climate issues that it had just a few years ago. I want to make some final comments on trade. I think what you'll get from a Biden administration, first and foremost, is predictability. There won't be sort of a gratuitous use of tariffs. You won't have President Biden threatening to impose tariffs on countries when it's unhappy with other aspects of the relationship. But I would not expect necessarily immediate movement on any new trade agreements. I think the first priority for a new administration will be to restore the U.S. economy, and over time there may be opportunities to expand upon the trade agreements that we currently have. But as I noted, I think initially the interest will be really in ensuring that the labor and environmental provisions of various agreements, especially the USMCA, are respected. But I think we'll see that in other countries as well. Now, ultimately, what's going to drive investment in Latin America, as you all know, are the steps that individual countries take. Are they respecting the rule of law? Is there ease of doing business? Are they reducing bureaucracy? Are they taking reforms that encourage foreign and domestic investment? Are they properly taxing their own population, investing resources in education and health? The Biden administration can, and I think will, help countries to achieve all that with aid programs, but ultimately it will be up to countries themselves to try to create a more appetizing environment for investors, foreign and domestic. And finally, I want to touch on the issue of China, which I know is of great interest and people often ask about, and how the Biden administration approach toward China might differ from the Trump administration. But I think what we've seen in the last few years, I think the current administration in the United States created a vacuum that China was happy to fill. The Trump administration left TPP on day one of the administration. They cut aid to the region. They imposed tariffs on countries in the region, and frankly treated countries with disrespect. And we heard, real bigoted language, frankly, from the president. So I think, unfortunately, the current administration made China look like a better partner in some ways than the United States. And that's most unfortunate, because I think that given a choice, countries would rather work with the United States in the region than with China. They understand the baggage that China brings. That said, it's hard to turn down large investments. And the fact is, China is and will remain a significant economic partner for countries in the region. As you all know, they're the number one trading partner for a lot of countries in the region. They're the number one investor in some countries. And that could be a good thing, for countries, as, if China is a healthy market for exports, if they're a source of investment. But there do need to be expectations that China abide by international labor standards, by environmental standards, and that they operate in a transparent way. But I think all of that really is related to one of the first points I made about the importance of democracy promotion and transparency in combating corruption. You need an open system that exposes abuses. And that's really the best way to ensure that China and any country respect investment norms and operates in the interest of the country where they are investing. So those are just some of the key issues that I anticipate a Biden administration will need to grapple with. There's obviously a lot more to talk about in many countries. I didn't have time to get into many issues. I didn't have time to get into, but I'm eager to take your questions and hear your comments and speak to some of the issues of most salience to you. So thanks so much again for the opportunity.
It's okay. Well, Mark, excellent. Very good overview of Colombia. Although description of the region surprised me, because there's no mention of Colombia. So do you have anything about Colombia that's like Colombia, or is it that what is it?
No, obviously a vital country, and especially when a Colombian is moderating this, I absolutely should have mentioned it. And I apologize. I actually had it in my initial remarks, and I cut them back just in the interest of time. Look, when I was in the Obama administration, the relationship that we had with Colombia was arguably the best that we had with really any country in the region. And Colombia was really our sort of our go-to partner for many issues, regional issues and global issues. And we were pleased to support the efforts of President Santos and the efforts of the Colombian people to achieve an historic peace agreement and then try to implement that. Look, there are plenty of complicated issues with regard to the relationship with Colombia. I think that the issue of drug production and the drug trade will continue to be an issue of great importance. I know there's great frustration on both sides at the lack of progress there. It happens in fits and starts. And in recent years, we've just seen an explosion in the production of coca, for example, in Colombia. I do think that the Biden administration will be eager to try to support efforts to implement the peace agreement. That ultimately will depend on the Colombian government, but I think that you'll have greater interest by the Biden administration than you've seen from the Trump administration to be supportive in that area. And I think you're going to hear some concern from, I would imagine, from a Biden team about issues of human rights, labor rights in Colombia. So I think a lot of some of the traditional issues that we've been managing together for a couple decades now will still be there, but I think with a different focus from the new team. I think one thing that Colombia has been very, very skillful in managing the relationship with the United States on a bipartisan basis, and that's been true. I mean, Plan Colombia and its East Colombia, the various efforts to support Colombia the last 20 years. I mean, those have all occurred across numerous administrations in the United States, Democratic and Republican, and through a whole series of administrations in Colombia as well, on the left and on the right. So I'm confident that there will continue to be a mature relationship, but I do think that there are some tough issues that both countries will have to grapple with.
4 leaders have not recognized President Biden. The North Korea, Russia, Colombia, Mexico, Brazil. The last 2 are the largest countries in Latin America. What do you think that means, and how can it go? How do you go forward?
Look, ultimately, that's a decision that the Brazilian government has to make, and the Mexican government has to make. I personally think it would be helpful if they accept reality. Joe Biden's going to take office on January 20th, and we all know that, and Donald Trump knows that. And I don't think it's helpful in the same, I don't think it's, look, I think that Donald Trump is undermining U.S. democracy with the lies that he has told about the elections here. I think it undermines the standing of the United States around the world. I don't think it's helpful for countries to implicitly or explicitly assist him in that effort. But look, that's obviously a decision that Mexicans and Brazilians are going to have to take. But I think it's for countries that have long enjoyed strong relationships on a bipartisan basis with the United States, that there's a risk that you put that into jeopardy because you appear to be playing into the partisan politics of the United States and interfering, perhaps in an indirect way in the U.S. election. I think that's helpful. But the reality is the world is moving on. And Joe Biden is having productive discussions with leaders from all over the world. I think yesterday he spoke to the president of Chile. I imagine he will speak with presidents of other countries. And if Mexico and Brazil don't want to be part of that process, and don't want to, build work to build a productive relationship with the incoming administration. That's their choice. I think it's unfortunate, but that's their decision.
The question from the public: what about Argentina?
So Argentina, look, in the Obama administration, there was basically two relationships. With the Cristina Fernandez administration, we didn't have much of a relationship, frankly. It was very, very difficult to find ways to collaborate. They had no interest, and that government was frankly hostile to the United States. And that changed dramatically when Macri took office, and President Obama, visited Argentina. First visit by U.S. president, I forget, 15, 20 years ago. And I think that was to the benefit of both countries. And you saw, an effort to work both on bilateral issues, but also on global matters as well, refugee issues, climate change. You saw a real spurt of interest from investors in the United States in Argentina. I think that the current Argentine government, intends to try to manage a relationship in a more sophisticated way than we saw from, a couple governments ago. I think that there will be disagreements, obviously. I don't think that the U.S. and Argentina necessarily see eye to eye on when it comes to Bolivia, perhaps, or Venezuela, or other regional issues. But that said, Argentina is a big, important country. And I think that there will be an effort on both sides to try to find, ways to work together to either narrow the differences or recognize those differences, but move on and find ways to collaborate in the economic and political sphere. So I think I'm hopeful it'll be a sophisticated, respectful relationship, unlike what was the case maybe 5, 6 years ago.
Regard for the next 18 months, what are the three things U.S. will do in Latin America? How would you put it like that?
Yeah. Well, first, it's hard to anticipate what will happen between now and the next 18 months and what sort of surprises that we'll have to face. Like I mentioned COVID, and, it's hard not to talk about that. I mean, Joe Biden's going to be inheriting an absolute disaster, domestically and internationally, with regard to COVID. And I think all these other things that we're talking about, economic rejuvenation and potential for more trade and investment, depends obviously on defeating the pandemic. And they're not. The economy and the pandemic aren't separate things. And Latin America has been hit, particularly hard. I mean, Peru, for example, which has been one of the great economic performers, in the last couple of decades, their economy has been declined 14% this year, and we're seeing, similar numbers from other countries. So I think the most important thing, again, this is a global effort, but I think it's going to have a big impact here. I think the most important thing for the administration to do is lead through the WHO, through PAHO, a strong global effort to ensure that everyone in the world has access to a vaccine. And in the United States, there's also always a lot of talk about what a challenge it's going to be to produce, to distribute, to ensure that everyone has access to and gets the vaccine. And that's in this country. And you can imagine the challenges that countries are less equipped institutionally, and they face all the social challenges that they do to achieve success. But I think we're going to have to work that. I think also just I noted it's a more respectful tone, which I think is very, very important, and just conveying that the United States does not view relationships as sort of a win-lose proposition. that work together, all countries can win. And that we're gonna, we're not gonna treat allies like enemies and vice versa. That we're gonna treat our allies with respect, that we're going to listen, that we're not going to surprise other countries with actions and work unilaterally. I think those are some of the, obviously, the bigger thematic issues. And then beyond that, look, I laid out some of the kinds of things we're going to need that I think a Biden administration will need to change. But I think, number one, dealing with COVID, and number two, just taking a different approach. I think it's going to just create opportunities to more successfully solve a lot of the problems and a lot of the challenges.
The other thing, President Biden has talked about a rules summit for democracies. How do you see that thing work, and how it will work for Latin America?
Yeah. Well, I think that, as I noted, the most important thing the United States can do with regard to democracy promotion is just be a good example. And Joe Biden will be a good example. And he's not going to, I noted, not going to be attacking the press or interfering in judicial investigations or calling for his political opponents to be jailed. That's what authoritarian leaders do. And I think that Donald Trump has given cover to a lot of authoritarian leaders around the world. So that's going to end. I think if you're going to advance democracy, I think it needs to be done on a non-ideological basis. In the case of the Trump administration, they've only gone after, been concerned about abuses on the left, and when their allies on the right have taken anti-democratic moves, there really hasn't been much of a response. So I think that's a second thing the Biden administration can do. Third, I think it'll be important to continue with the various assistance programs the United States has, and to expand them, whether through USAID or the Department of Justice or others, to strengthen democratic institutions. But it's not just, it's a combination of strengthening government institutions, but also supporting civil society, because no democracy can succeed without a vibrant civil society as well. And I think it's important, in democracy promotion, for the administration to work on a multilateral basis. It's much more effective when countries in the region are working together in support of democratic forces than when the United States is working alone, trying to impose a particular solution. So I think those are just some of the steps I anticipate you'll see a Biden administration
in elections. One of the things that took and U.S. elections went by was support of the Lino to Trump much more than expected, particularly this Cuban American. Does that mean that because of U.S. politics, real change towards Cuba will not happen? It will have to, because of the elections?
No, I think that the Biden administration approach toward Cuba will be based on what's in the U.S. national interest and what's in the interest of the Cuban people. And, over the last 60 years, the United States has largely pursued a policy that has failed. It's failed to improve the lives of Cuban people, and it's failed to, advance democracy and human rights on the island. And look, I think it was considered controversial. It was considered bold, when President Obama tried to normalize relations with Cuba, and allowed Americans to travel and do business there. But there was a lot of support for that. There was a lot of support for that in the Cuban American community as well. And so I think I do anticipate that relatively early on in the administration that Joe Biden will reverse a lot of the damaging steps that Donald Trump has taken with regard to Cuba. But it won't be historic. it'll be sort of a return to where we might have been a few years ago. But I think that, you know, with regard to Cuba, I think one of the problems has been that in some ways it's taken on more importance in U.S. political discourse and U.S. foreign policy than it merits. Now, I'm passionate about the issue of democracy and human rights in Cuba. It's very, very important. The United States should be on the right side there. But that said, I think in some cases it's come to dominate administration's thinking. I think the current administration views Latin America through the prism of Cuba, which is to say they don't understand Latin America. And I think, you know, the Biden administration will have its Cuba policy and take the appropriate steps. But it, you know, it's not going to come at the expense of, you know, paying attention to, you know, Mexico or Central America or Venezuela or other relationships in the region. It will be one of many issues that the United States needs to grapple with.
And what about Peru? Peru's had the three presidents in a week. How do you see that?
Well, you know, Peru, this is not the first time in the last 20 years that Peru has undergone political turmoil. They've had a number of presidents who have been, you know, prosecuted, investigated, impeached, jailed, what have you. And yet, despite it all, you know, the economy has had really extraordinary performance among the best performers in the world the last couple of decades. So there's been this divergence between political turmoil and economic performance. The question now is whether that will continue. I think it seems that the situation has settled there now, that there is broad support for the new president, third in a week. But I think he seems to be the right person to lead an interim government that will, you know, take the country to the elections in April and then a transition in July. I think he's someone who demonstrators and others who care about issues of anti-corruption, I think he's someone who can help advance that effort as well. But, you know, you have a dissonance now between on the one hand, the political class and the Peruvian people, not unique to Peru, but you have a political class that seems very distant from the population and not acting in the interest of Peruvian citizens, and certainly with regard to the issue of corruption, not taking seriously the concerns of Peruvian citizens and frankly of the international community, of whether it's, you know, foreign governments or businesses are looking to invest there. So I think arguably, you know, the turmoil of the last few weeks could end up being a positive thing, in which you've had now that clearly the reformers seem to have won. You know, those who wanted to limit anti-corruption reform, they've been set back, and I think, you know, that might influence as well how the electoral campaign is carried out and the kind of appeals that politicians will have to make to win the election. But I'm hopeful that in the same way that Peru's been able to, you know, manage its other periods of turmoil, that it will effectively navigate this one as well.
And with the UN, how do you see the U.S. playing with UN and U.S. in issues like inequality? How to play in Latin America?
Yeah. Well, I mean, on the issue of inequality, I mean, Latin America, you know, had made extraordinary progress in reducing poverty and reducing extreme poverty. And, you know, initially the gains from the economic growth in the region were shared, you know, fairly broadly. A lot of countries instituted, you know, social programs, conditional cash transfers, that have been very effective. They've been copied around the world. In fact, even the United States, some local governments have taken real interest in some of the programs that Latin American governments have developed. That said, similar to what we've seen in the United States and in other countries, there's clearly, despite the decline in extreme poverty, at least before the pandemic, there's been widening inequalities. And we're seeing that, play out in Chile, for example, and the protests there around the quality of services, quality of education, quality of health, and the inequities in those systems. And obviously, that's something that many countries are struggling with. The United States is struggling with it as well. We have real inequalities here, and in recent years, the gap between the wealthiest and the most disadvantaged has widened. So I think domestically, you're going to see a Biden administration try to work toward building a stronger middle class and providing greater opportunities for people, and that's part of the Build Back Better mantra and policy that Joe Biden has put forward to create opportunities. And I think there's a real opportunity for countries to share experiences about the most effective way to promote growth, but do so in an equitable fashion. And no one has the immediate answers there. But I do think that in the context of the debate within the IGB and others, I think there's an opportunity to exchange views and for us all to learn from each other about the most successful ways to go about this.
Through the last few years, particularly President Trump made the move to get people out of China into Latin America. What about that? Will President Biden do this, follow the same policy?
To try to get Latin American countries to deal less with China? Is that
no, yeah. Or then to take things like manufacturing in Latin America.
I see. Yeah. Let me look. Ultimately, the relationship, China's role in Latin America, and the ability of these countries to replace China as a manufacturing hub is ultimately going to depend on steps, as I noted, that the countries in question take. And I think, all things being considered, I think certainly a lot of American companies would prefer to invest here. I think there's a bipartisan agreement now about the nature of the Chinese regime and their economic practices. So I think clearly there's an opportunity there. But it's up to the countries in question to ensure that there's proper rule of law, and that foreign investors feel comfortable investing. I mean, look, I work the Albright Stonebridge group, but we work with companies that are looking to invest in a lot of Latin American countries, and they're often frustrated. There are some great opportunities, but they're often frustrated by the bureaucracy they're dealing with, by the red tape, by the politicization of various issues. So the opportunities are there, and the opportunities are greater now than they were, certainly 20 years ago. And I do think, the Biden administration will be positioned to try to help, countries create, more favorable environments for investment. But it's not something you can sort of dictate and decide, okay, this is gonna happen. We're gonna sort of move supply chains in a certain direction. Ultimately, investment is going to follow, where the greatest opportunities are. So I think this is a moment for Latin America to take advantage of the concerns about China. But they can't assume that it's going to happen automatically. But they've got to take some important measures as well for that.
Mark, thanks a lot for your involvement. But I think we had a very interesting conversation. Touched a lot of the, and hopefully, things will be good. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.